Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. There's something I've become attentive to in photography recently, since this summer. In my own photography, and when I see other people taking pictures, not snapshots, not iPhone pictures, but when I see videos of photographers out in the wild, it's something that I call the photographer's crouch. You know, a photographer puts the camera up to their eye and they crouch down as if by lowering their head 6 inches, they're going to get a better shot than if they just stand straight.
Guilty as charged. I do that all the time.
I don't know why we do that.
Well, for me, it's weird. Even though I have a camera that has a little swivel LCD on the back, for some reason, I like looking through the viewfinder.
Oh, I do too. But why do photographers crouch when they look through the viewfinder?
Oh, because it's an action pose? I have no idea.
Well, one way that we can avoid this is by using a tripod. And we've done an episode on tripods some time ago. We'll link in the show notes. When you use a tripod, things are very different. So, for example, I've talked about the flower photos that I take. And when I do that, I set the tripod up at the height that corresponds to the way I want to shoot the flowers, which are on my desk in my office with the background. So the camera may be too low for me to look directly into it without crouching. Of course, I can flip up the LCD. And when I'm initially setting up a shot like that, I do use the LCD, and then I want to look through the viewfinder just to make sure.
Same here.
But then when I start taking pictures, I'm like, I can stand up straight because I don't have to hold the camera up to my eye to press the shutter. So this week, we wanted to talk about ways to step away from the camera, to take pictures without holding it up to your eye, without holding it up and looking at the LCD, to avoid that photographer's crouch, because as we age, that's going to deteriorate our backs.
That's really all this is about. This is just, we're getting old, everything hurts, especially for photographers, like all of our gear and everything. But you're right. And it's not just the crouch. Sometimes you need to do extra things to prevent moving the camera, which is especially important in those situations.
Yes. Well, in these flower photos, as I've mentioned, what I do is I shoot at the lowest ISO that I can. It's on a tripod. Why should I shoot with a high ISO, right?
Right.
I can shoot 3 seconds or 5 seconds if necessary for the light. And I do it with natural light instead of, floodlights and strobes and everything. And again, I can shoot for 3 or 5 seconds. They're not moving. They're not going anywhere. There's no wind. So you have this latitude on a tripod. And I tried a couple of different methods for pressing the shutter, and we'll discuss these different methods because there are different ways you can do this. But it's kind of interesting to take the time, and you can't do this for everything. You can't do this for, shooting cats or pictures of your kids, things like that. You can do this for portraits. You can do it for landscapes. Put something on a tripod, take the time, step back, look around. Don't be in such a hurry.
Yeah. Well, and also there are a lot of creative possibilities because, yes, mechanically we want to make sure the camera doesn't move, and there are reasons for that. But maybe there are situations where you can't be close to your camera. Like maybe you can't actually touch that shutter release button. Or maybe you want to do something creative, like you want an exceptionally long time-lapse photography or super long exposures. And just the way the cameras are made, they're really designed for capturing things in the moment. And so sometimes you need to supplement that a little bit with a different way of triggering the shutter.
Well, the oldest way to do that is to use, I guess we used to call it a cable release.
I think it's still called a cable released.
And so you screw that into the hole in the middle of the shutter. If you're a hip photographer, you'll have to take out your soft shutter button or whatever it's called first. And it's essentially kind of like a syringe. You push the syringe end, and that sets off the shutter inside the shutter button, below the shutter button.
Yeah. And actually, I thought that those were basically like old tech gone. Nobody uses that anymore. But it turns out that a lot of cameras, like our Fuji X-T3s, they built that into the shutter button. So these cable releases are not very expensive at all. It's just a little, mechanical press. And that's one way that you could do this on some cameras. My old XT1, I don't think had that.
Okay.
Because it had a different input. And so what I had for that and what I had for my old Nikon too, you can buy separate cable releases that are, in that case, it had I want to say it was a micro USB cable that connected in. Some of them have just like your regular sort of audio input jacks. Like a
headphone jack.
Headphone jack, yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, that's something that the XT3 uses. So my old cable release doesn't work on the new one, but it also means that I can use, dozens and dozens of different compatible ones.
You don't have to buy the Fuji brand that's $79. You can get I can't remember which brand I got that was $15, 15 pounds.
Exactly. In fact, I was looking at some of these earlier before we started talking today, because I still need to replace my old shutter release. I don't have one for the new camera. And I was looking through Rico Firstinger's book that I think we've mentioned before, Fuji X Secrets. And he mentioned a Canon RS60E3 cable release because that's a very common type. He likes it for a number of reasons, and you can get that, or as I was looking on Amazon, there are a bunch of options that are like, $10, $12.
Chinese compatible, all look the same with different names on them.
So what's different about these, in addition to just being able to push a button and trigger, you have the ability to push a button and, hold it down for a longer length of time, or they have a little lock that will lock the switch. And so you can just keep the shutter open for a long, long time without making your finger sore because you're holding the button down for so long.
You youngins don't know anything. with the syringe one, you can also push the shutter and hold it for a long time. And around the bit where you push, there's generally a little thing you screw in to lock it, so you don't have to keep holding your thumb on it.
So complicated. Yeah. Yes. However,
the advantage is they're not electronic devices, so nothing can go wrong electronically. If all of a sudden your cable release dies when you're out by the Grand Canyon, you wanted to get that selfie by the edge of the canyon.
Yes. Well, and actually, I was going to interject and say, does your syringe style have a little LCD screen? Because some of these have little screens where you can set up like an intervalometer and set timing, and that doesn't appeal to me because I think that there are other ways to do it.
On our cameras, you can set timing, and in fact, we'll get to that in a second. What I like about the electronic ones is you can do the half press and the full press quite easily.
Yes.
It's a lot softer than the syringe, because the syringe is moving a mechanical button inside the camera that's a little bit stiffer than the shutter button that we normally push. So you can use that little half press to focus, full press to shoot your photo, and you can just leave it dangling. It's not going to, nothing can break, no batteries, it's self-powered, but it is electronic. If you're out in the elements, that means you got to open a little door. And if your camera's weather resistant, I don't think that part where you plug it in is weather resistant.
Yeah, I think that depends entirely on the camera. However, another thing that you might want to think about for these is the length of the cable, because in a lot of cases, you may not have a very long cable, and it may not be important because what you're doing is you're using that cable release to trigger the shutter so that you're not moving the camera at all. Because of course, just pushing the shutter button can introduce movement if you're doing a long exposure. You might want to look for something that has a longer cable if you can't be right next to the camera. Like for example, let's say you're setting it for a landscape shot and you found a nice spot where the camera and the tripod can go, but there's maybe not enough room for you to be right there. If you have a good 4 or 5 foot cable, then you can still trigger the shutter without getting too close to that edge of the canyon, which everybody stay away from the edge of the canyons. They eat photographers. It happens all the time.
Yes, it does. So my preferred method of doing this for my flowers is I just use the timer.
Oh, right.
Because the only thing that I want to do is avoid the camera shake. As you say, when you press the shutter, the camera is going to shake. I've got carpeting in my office, so the tripod is still going to move a little when I press it. If it was a hard surface, it would move less, but still a tiny bit. So whenever I turn my camera on for this, I have set in the My Menu thing, so it shows up when I press the menu button. If you have other brands of cameras, you know that there are ways to put menu items you use often somewhere for quick access. On Fuji, you can put them in so they show up when you press the menu button, and it goes to the timer, and I set it for 2 seconds. I don't need longer because all I'm doing is avoiding that shake, and after a second, the camera is stable.
And after you start that, you make a point of jumping up and down next to the tripod, right?
Yes.
So that you get that whole motion.
Well, after I press the shutter, I jump. I do that kind of Pete Townsend thing, with the guitar to make sure. But I've only used 2, 5, and 10 seconds, which are the settings, but I think you can dial in your own setting on this camera. I'm sure you can. But essentially, the 2 second is what I'm doing in an indoor space. The 5 second is maybe you want to make sure that if the camera is really not stable, you want to make sure that, 2 seconds, it still might shake. The 10 seconds is you want to press the button and run around so you can be in the picture. Family photo, right?
Right.
That's the classic thing. In fact, I remember back in the day, my Olympus cameras had that little dial on the front, which was the timer. I think it was always 10 seconds. So to the right of the lens, like down below the shutter button, there was a little dial. You had a spring on it. You'd wind it back, and then it would start going.
Oh, yes. Now the little LED on the front tends to blink on a lot of cameras to just sort of tell you're getting close.
Well, the Fuji beeps a little bit to let you know.
Oh, I turned off all my sounds.
Beep. Oh, no, I kind of leave it on for that. I have my shutter on with the quietest little sound because I do want to know when the shutter has gone off. But the beep is kind of helpful. I never do it outside.
It always drives me slightly crazy. I know I'm going to sound like a snob, but when you go someplace and somebody has their camera artificial shutter sound at like the maximum, and it's like, chiki, chiki.
Especially when they're doing 7 frames a second.
I am terribly sorry, listeners, that you have to listen to that.
although what's worse is like you're in a Senate hearing and you've got all these photographers using DSLRs, so they're mechanical shutters anyway.
Yeah.
And you hear them going on drive mode, and it sounds like a firing range.
Yeah.
Just as an aside, we should put in the show notes the thing about this guy in the Senate hearings a week ago.
Yes.
With that wooden view. Do you call it a view camera? It was probably like a 4x5 camera, the kind you look down to.
It was a medium format. I want to say like Viewmaster, but that's not right. Viewmaster is the old toy.
That's the 3D things with the rings and Anyway, we'll put a link in the show notes because this made a lot of the photography websites. He was like right in the front row as they were taking pictures of one of the witnesses before the person started testifying. And I think there's something quaint about that.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it turns out he has been, so I believe DP Review did an interview with him. He has shot all of the impeachment hearings with this big camera, and not just this year, like he was there for Nixon and also for Clinton. And so just sort of out of tradition, he's like, well, there's an impeachment going on. I'm going to go take my big camera down. And there's a fantastic picture of him, with his big, it's a big wooden camera with this massive lens on it, like massive in diameter, not in length.
Yeah.
And he takes the picture, and I think when they talked to him, he didn't know if the picture should come out yet because, of course, he's shooting on film. He still has to go back and develop it. It was also neat that all the other photographers there just sort of like paid this deference. It's like, oh, it's that guy. Yeah. Let him come to the front because he's going to need more light. He's going to need, direct access. He can't just lift his camera up over his head like the rest of us.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, well, let's take a break. We'll find that to put it in the show notes. And when we come back, we'll talk about more ways to control your camera without touching it. Magical ways to control your camera.
Excellent.
Okay, so we had the syringe shutter release. We had the plugged-in shutter release. Another possibility is when you're using your iPhone to take pictures of people.
Now, wait a minute.
Everyone uses an iPhone.
I didn't know that we could do this with the iPhone. Actually,
well,
I did, but I'm trying to transition. That didn't work.
Right. That's very good. You're leading. You're playing the straight man here.
Yeah.
Trying to prime my story. So if you have an Apple Watch and you're taking photos with an iPhone, what you can do is set the iPhone up. This doesn't have to be a tripod. This could be just leaning on a table against a glass, right? If you want to take a selfie at a party, or you've got a bunch of friends and you want to get a picture of everyone with you involved. So you open the camera app on the watch, and you have two little buttons. The button in the center is the shutter button, looks exactly the same as the shutter button on the camera. And the second button is a timer, and you tap that, and it goes 3, 2, 1, click, and the iPhone flashes a little bit. The screen on the iPhone flashes as the seconds go down with the numbers. It's really quite interesting. Then on the left, you can tap to see what your photo looks like. To see if it's worked out. So you could presumably take one of those little iPhone holders and put it on, I don't know, the hood ornament of your car, right?
Yeah.
And you could be in your car driving, and you could tap this as you're going to take pictures while you're driving, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Well, and also
that's what it's designed for, to put on hood ornaments.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah, that's the Johnny Ive put it on your Bentley,
exactly,
because he can just get he can get 5 more iPhones at a moment's notice. So I have to say, when they came out with this on the watch, I was like, okay, this is cheesy, and it's probably just a proof of technology that they could do this. I've used this quite often because it lets you figure out your composition, especially if you're going to be in the shot. One thing that you do need to know is you need to set your mode on the phone first. So like you can't switch from the regular camera to the portrait camera. That you have to set up on the phone first. But you don't necessarily have to have the camera app running on the phone when you start this. Even if the phone is locked, you bring up the camera app on your watch, then it will open the camera app on your phone and you can control it there.
I didn't know that. That's nifty.
It's actually very slick, and I used it this weekend. We were trying to take some pictures for our holiday cards and just kind of messing around and getting some lights in the background, and totally set up my iPhone on a tripod and was able to, stand far enough away from it that we could frame all of us in. It's super useful. I'm really surprised.
Now, I can think of a surreptitious use for this. You leave an iPhone someplace leaning against something in a position that it can view something.
Yes.
And then you go away 20, 30 feet away. You probably still have to be within Bluetooth range.
I think so,
30
yeah.
feet. And then you open the camera app and you can both see what's going on and take pictures of it.
You could. Although I think it would be obvious that the camera would just start coming on.
What you do see is the flash on the screen, so you'd need to hide the screen.
Yeah.
But if the screen is against something and the light's not going to flash, you could do that. Now, I'm just thinking of a more practical way. We just got a new bird feeder in the garden, and I'd really like to take some pictures of the birds. I could use my Fuji and set it up on a tripod, but I could also just stick my iPhone someplace. I have one of those little clamps, like, what would you call it? The clamp with a screw, like a C clamp underneath, and then it holds the iPhone. And I could just put that like on the feeder in a position where I could catch the birds, and they'll just ignore it, and I'll be able to take pictures.
Another thing to note is you can control some of the features of the camera. Like, for example, if you press and hold the shutter button down on the watch, it will start the sort of instant recording feature that's new with iOS 13.
Well, if you press and hold the button, you get a number of options like flash, HDR. You can flip the camera to the front screen, and you can also choose live photos.
Instead of just like tapping the shutter button once to take a tap, tap and rest, not tap and press.
Interesting. It's really quite impressive. Now, if only the watch could take pictures.
I'm really glad that it doesn't. That would just be weird.
You hold your wrist up to take pictures of people. That would look a little bit strange. So the next step is to use a remote app if your camera supports it. Now, one of the problems with this is you have to connect to Wi-Fi to be able to do this. And that means you launch the Wi-Fi on the camera. You tell your phone to connect to the camera's Wi-Fi network. And there's no sort of one button way to access it. But it gives you the same kind of control. In fact, it gives you even more controls than what you get with the watch on the iPhone. The Fujifilm app lets you take pictures, focus. It's a tap to set a focus point. You can view pictures and transfer them to your phone. You can do all sorts of things. The main use there is basically, for me, it would be to control the camera. I've set up something and I'm waiting. Say that I've set up my camera to take photos of the birds at the feeders, and I'm just staring at my phone till the birds show up, and then I'll tap and get a picture.
Exactly. Well, and you also have more control over the actual settings. So if you are taking a group shot, for example, and you realize that your exposure's too low, you can change the ISO or the shutter speed or the aperture and do that without having to okay, everybody stop. I need to go back around the camera and twiddle with the settings. You can just sort of do it right there.
Yeah.
The wireless part of it always ends up being the weak link. And I have to say that in the current ones, I mean, I know we keep going back to our Fujis, but the Fuji X-T3 does a much better job of connecting first via Bluetooth and then switching to Wi-Fi. Before, you had to go into the iPhone settings, go to the Wi-Fi settings, connect to the camera. It was more cumbersome, but still, for whatever reason, sometimes that just doesn't work. So that's the only time when you would think that, maybe a wired release is the way to go.
Okay, so finally, and this is something you picked as a snapshot some time ago, the Myops mobile dongle. Maybe you can refresh our memory about that.
Yeah, so the idea behind this is it's like a cable release, only instead of connecting the cable from your camera to something that you're holding, it's connected to your phone. I found a little mount that I could put in the hot shoe of the camera that would then support a holder for the iPhone. It's kind of big and awkward. I'll have a picture in the show notes to see what this looks like, or you just hold it in your hand. But basically, it gives you a lot more options because you now have an app that can run all this. And so the Myops app has modes for doing time lapses, long exposures, and even interesting things that use some of the the other sensors that are in the phone. So again, in the show notes, I'll put a picture of this up. I did a photo shoot where I wanted to have some coffee beans just sort of jumping in the air. And so I set this up so that the shutter would be triggered by sound. So whenever there's a loud sound, that's when it would trigger it. And you can also do this they have modes for like catching lightning. If there's a bright flash, it's using the camera's optics through software to trigger the shutter. So it has a lot of interesting options, and it's not very expensive either.
So could I set this up? I'm looking at the website, and it looks like one of the options is motion. Does it mean that it can tell the camera to detect motion? So
yes,
when the birds land on the feeder, it could automatically take a shot.
Exactly. In fact, I wrote about this, I think, a few years earlier. Maybe it was an earlier version for Macworld. I'll put a link in the show notes. And that's exactly what I did. I had the camera pointed at a bird feeder. You could do it for, trying to capture cats walking across. And when it detects motion, and there's an option to sort of set how sensitive that is. So windy tree branches aren't going to trigger it, that you can have it automatically trigger that. That's an example of something where you don't want to be standing there because maybe, your presence is going to keep the birds away. So you just leave this here, you go at a safe distance, or you just leave it there for a while. And as long as you have enough battery power, it will just keep taking shots whenever it detects the motion or the sound or what have you. And then you come back to it and see what you got.
So there are two parts to this. There's the dongle, and then there's the cable that connects to the camera. I'm just looking on the website. There seem to be a lot of different cables. Even for Fuji, there are two different cables. Can you buy the other cables separately if you need?
Yeah.
So if you change cameras,
you have to buy another cable.
Right, but you can without buying the whole dongle. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Oh, there's even an extension cable that's 2 meters. Now that's even more interesting. Ooh. So when you had talked about this on the show, I thought this was interesting and I said, oh, maybe I should get this. And I never did. But now I'm seeing that this really could be interesting.
I should also note there are a lot of different devices. There are some that are, little electronic pods that you put on the hot shoe that connect in that will communicate either via Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. There are a lot of different things that are out there. When I wrote this article for DP Review, again, I'll link it in. I compared that with another product called the Alpine Labs Spark. And the Spark was one that it's just this little battery-powered device that sits on top of the camera. And it had a lot of the same features, but the software just didn't work out very well. And so I found, to my surprise, because that was more of a wireless option communicating with the phone, to my surprise, just having a cable that went from the camera to my phone and the MyOps software worked out the best.
Okay, so I'm looking on Amazon UK, and it's not clear which models need which cable, so you should go to the MyOps website if you are interested to make sure you get the right cable. Certain brands have different cables, like Fuji has 2. The only downside I see to this is that you do need to get a new cable if you change even camera models, perhaps. But it kind of makes sense because the camera models, they change their plugs. These are using the headphone jack. They're not using a USB. And it could be that they go from a mini to a micro headphone jack at some point in a camera model.
With my XT1, it used USB, and with the XT3, it uses that headphone jack.
Ah, okay. Okay. All right. Well, I'm looking at our notes, and it looks like we've covered everything that we needed to cover, but you have one more thing.
Part of the idea of this episode, when we were tossing around ideas, was to step away from the camera. And part of that is because it's winter for most of us, and this is a time when we probably don't shoot often. And when you're inside, when you're doing more, say, flower photography or still lifes or whatever, this type of trigger release can come in handy. Or if you're in an area that has pretty good night skies, set up your trigger somehow, like put your camera on a tripod on your deck pointed up at the stars, and then stay inside where it's nice and warm and get pictures, long exposures of the sky.
Good idea.
There are a lot of creative uses for this. It's not just, I just want to make sure that I don't move the camera when I'm taking a shot. And I think especially during the winter, when you might not be out and about as much, it's a perfect time to explore some of those options.
Okay, well, that's enough. I think it's time for our snapshots.
So I'm going to go with gear this week, a little bit of gear. I have an L bracket for my camera. Now, an L bracket is basically something that sits, you attach to the bottom of your camera, and it also comes up along the side. They make them for all different types of cameras. You need to go find one that's going to match your model, of course, because it has to fit well. This one is the Photomix LB-XT3 for my Fujifilm X-T3 camera. And it seems like something that would be superfluous because you're adding something that's basically on the camera most of the time. The advantage is it's designed so that it has a ridge that fits into a Swiss Arca plate. And so when you're using a tripod, and let's say you set it up in your typical landscape orientation, if you want to switch to portrait orientation, sometimes you would have to mess with the tripod or switch it into a different mode. Here, you just detach your camera, put it on its side, and you automatically have another way to mount that on your tripod. It's super quick, it's super easy, and this isn't big enough or heavy enough to really affect the weight and the size of the camera. So, and this particular one actually also has a bunch of little screw holes, so you can mount all sorts of things to it if you want. I have no need to do that, but if you need to attach a boom mic and you're recording video, you can do that. It's not very expensive. This was about $21, $22. There are some that you can get from better manufacturers that are like $60, $70. But quite honestly, this is perfect for what I need. It's like machined aluminum and works great.
I have a cheap one that's not specific to the camera. And the problem with that is you can't always get the door open on the side, or you can't always get the battery thing open. But I found that what you need to do, it doesn't matter if you're working on a tripod. It doesn't have to be flush with the camera. So what you do is you mount it. The one that I have, you loosen the screw and you can slide it horizontally. So I put the screw and I slide it all the way to the left. So there's room to open the left door. And it doesn't matter if that bit is far from the camera when you put it on the tripod, as long as it's connected to the camera in a stable way. Does that make sense?
It does.
So it sticks out a couple inches to be able to allow the door to open, and you can still use it. I find it adds a little bit of extra weight when I do it. I don't use it very much. I mentioned some time ago that I use just a little shoe that I keep on the bottom of the camera. Anyway, I don't like shooting portrait mode. I think it's against nature. So
good reason. There we go.
Yep.
What do you have this week?
Okay, I wanted to find something that wasn't photography, something that was art. And I've mentioned a couple things like Japanese woodblock prints and others. And in episode number 22, I mentioned a film by Andrei Tarkovsky called Stalker. So this week, I want to talk about a book by Jeff Dyer. He's someone who's written a lot about photography. In fact, he wrote a book about Gary Winogrand's street photography recently, which I don't know if I've picked as a snapshot, but I should. What he does in this book called Zona, a book about a film, about a journey to a room, is there are 142 short sections that correspond to the 142 shots of the film. And he's discussing what's happening, but he's also discussing how it looks. He's also discussing sometimes the composition. It's not really a book about film or photography. It's a book about a film, which can make you, if you've seen this film, watch it again in a different way.
Those are the best kinds of books.
They are. And I always find that it's interesting to have visual art that makes us think about photography slightly differently.
You know, this makes me realize that there are so many movies that touch on photography or focus on photography.
Focus on photography. Good.
Focus on photography. Thank you.
Yep.
So that makes me think, what are some other movies that we should watch, perhaps, during the holiday breaks? Go to the Photoactive Facebook group and post some titles of photo-related movies that you like. Thinking of maybe Rear Window might be a possibility.
Blowout,
yeah. Oh, I haven't seen that in a very long time.
Yeah. And there's a new movie on Netflix called Earthquake Bird with Alicia Vikander, and it takes place in Japan. It's a woman who lives in Japan. She's Swedish and she moved to Japan, and she meets a photographer. And their relationship is partly based around the pictures that he takes of her.
Okay, listeners, help us out. What should we be watching?
Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.